Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Welcome to another video. Hey, I'm in coastal South Carolina, visiting a good photography friend of mine. We're out shooting American oyster catchers. It's a little chilly here. It's like in the 30s. It gets colder here than it does in Florida where I live, but it's a little cold. Here with the Canon R1, and this video is going to be my full setup video for the Canon R1 for birds and birds in flight. I've had the camera now since it came out. I've got enough time on it now that I feel like I've pretty much solidified my settings for this camera. So I'm going to share them with you. So if you're interested in knowing how I set up the Canon R1, stay tuned. Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Happy holidays to everybody. Hey, it's actually kind of cool down here in East Central Florida, which I wait for every year. It's been every summer gets hotter, longer, right? I don't know. It's nice now. I hope it stays this way for a while. The video I'm going to do today is on the Canon R1. I've had it since you had it. Maybe you're going to get one, but if you got yours right after it came out or right when it came out, that's when I got mine. I've been shooting it pretty much exclusively since then, and I think I have my settings pretty much locked in now. Like I said in the intro to this video, up in South Carolina. So I'm going to do my full menu deep dive in this video. I'm going to go through every menu. Well, maybe not every one, because I'm not going to go through the connections menu, Bluetooth and hooking up to your phone and all that kind of stuff. I'm really interested in that. If you want to hook your camera up to your phone, go ahead. It's in there. I'm not going to go over that stuff. I'm going to go over what I consider the really important stuff and explain a little bit about why I made the settings, the setting choices I made, and of course, birds in flight are what I do for the most part, so it's going to be centered on that. Take what you think will work for you. I don't pretend to think that my settings are the best for everybody, but it's a place to start. So here we go. Let's get into the menu of the Canon R1. Okay, here we are in the Canon R1's menu system, and we're going to take a bit of time to go through most of these menus, and we're going to start in the very beginning, of course, with the first tab of the shoot menu, the red camera menu, image quality and size, and JPEG HEIF quality. Well, I guess we should first talk about JPEG versus HEIF. That's how I pronounce HEIF. Maybe it's HEIF, I don't know. It stands for High Efficiency Image Format, and it has some advantages over JPEG. So if you're going to shoot something other than RAW, which I don't most of the time, you may want to consider HEIF, in that it's more efficient compression, higher bit rate, better color depth, all this kind of stuff goes into that format. It actually is a more efficient compression as well, so your files will be even smaller than if you shot JPEGs. So it's something to consider. We can go into this menu and you can see that you can change the quality of the settings for your JPEG and HEIF. I'm not going to go into these. You can go in and you can change what you like if you shoot either JPEG or HEIF along with RAW, or just JPEG and HEIF and no RAW images. I shoot almost 99+% of the time I'm shooting RAW, so that's what I do, and I'm not going to spend any more time on this. Going down to the image size type, you can see I shoot CRAW, and this is where inside this menu you can choose what you want to shoot. RAW, if we go up here, we can shoot no RAW, we can shoot full RAW, or we can shoot CRAW. I shoot CRAW because I've shot RAW and CRAW in Canon cameras forever, and I just have not seen any difference. And of course, there's big advantages to shooting CRAW over RAW. Smaller file sizes mean you hit the buffer less often, the buffer wall I call it. More room on your card, quicker dump of your buffer, all that kind of stuff. In the Canon R1, one of the big advantages of the Canon R1, say over, well, I'm going to call it a big advantage. It's a big advantage to me, maybe not to you, but one of the big advantages of shooting CRAW in the Canon R1 over the Canon R5 Mark II is that you basically, if you're shooting to a fast, compact flash express card, you've got an unlimited buffer. Just press the shutter button and let her rip at 40 frames per second, and it'll go and go and go. So that can be really important if you've got some action going on in front of you, and it continues and continues and continues, and you want to just keep shooting. That can be a problem with the Canon R5 Mark II. CRAW. You can see for the JPEG HEIF option, I do not have any of these chosen. I just have the hyphen, and that means I'm not shooting JPEG or HEIF. Let's move on out of there. You can come down to the crop aspect ratio. It is early in the morning. My mouth isn't working quite right. We'll see how we go here this morning. Go in there. I shoot full. That's full, no crop. That's 24 megapixels on this camera. And so that's generally what I'm doing. Now, I'm going to take a little time to explain the difference between cropping and aspect ratio, because there's a big difference. If you shoot in full, or if you come over and you shoot in 1:1, or 4:3, or 16:9, your images are recorded the whole sensor, full resolution. So if you go in and you're processing your images and you decide you don't want it to be 16:9 and you want the full size of the image, you can recover that. This right here, 1.6, this is a crop. That's why it says crop in parentheses, and it has the little magnifying glass with the plus sign in there. This, when you shoot in 1.6 times crop, you do not record the full resolution of the camera. You're cropping in 1.6 times using that portion more center of the sensor. You're not recording all 24 megapixels. If you decide you want the full frame later and you shot them in cropped mode, you cannot recover those. That is the main difference. If we go into info, you can mask or outline your shooting area. So if you're in one of those other formats, aspect ratios, not cropping now, 16:9 or whatever, you can choose how it looks through the viewfinder. That's what that's for. All right, so let's back out of here. Let's move on to the next tab in the shoot menu. Up at the top, exposure compensation. I shoot full manual exposure. We're not dealing with exposure compensation. I wouldn't change it here anyway if I was going to use exposure compensation. So anyway, that's grayed out. Why is it grayed out? Let's go in there. Restricted because of ISO speed and pre-continuous shooting being turned on. Okay, so that's the thing about these cameras nowadays, is you're going to find that a lot of things are interconnected in here. If you have certain settings set, you're not going to be able to set certain other settings. So that's why it takes a little time spent in the menus and playing around to determine how all this is interrelated. Let's move down to ISO speed settings. You can go in here and you can set your ISO speed. Who does that in the main menu? Not many people. You're going to have one of your dials set up for that, but you can choose the speed range and a range for if you're in auto ISO, coming down the line here, minimum shutter speed, audio. Lots of stuff in here that you can do to tailor how the camera chooses ISO and how high or low it'll go for you. I pretty much have them set to the maximum for the most part. Anti-flicker shooting, this one's grayed out. We'll go and see why, because you got pre-continuous shooting turned on. We'll go over all that later. This is if you're shooting in some sort of lighting where you're in an arena, you've got flicker involved, fluorescent lighting, stuff like that. You can turn these on and off. I'm shooting birds outside. Don't have to worry about these. They're off. External speed light control, we're not going to go into. I don't shoot flash for my birds, so we're not going to go into that, but you can control a speed light, a Canon speed light, or even an off-brand third-party speed light from within the menu system. It's handy. I do shoot some flash when I'm doing macro, say down in Costa Rica, but we're not going to go into that here because that's a little bit of a specialized situation and would take up a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into that. Metering mode. I have this set to spot metering. Like I said earlier, I shoot full manual exposure, so I don't let my meter do anything to any of the parameters, whether it be shutter speed, aperture, or ISO. So I set my metering to spot because what that does is it puts that circle, that gray circle in the middle of the frame, gives me a reference to the center of the frame that is always there. So that's my reasoning for picking spot metering mode. It has nothing to do with metering. Detect priority, auto exposure while autofocusing. I've messed around with this. It's not applicable. It doesn't do much for what I do, birds in flight, so that's turned off. Moving down to the third tab, picture style and color space and all this kind of stuff. If you're shooting JPEG or HEIF, this can come into play when you're reviewing your images on the back of your LCD screen or through your viewfinder. Those settings will be displayed to you. But if you're shooting RAW, these settings really don't affect anything. They're recorded with the RAW files as EXIF data, metadata, and they can be used and maybe looked at by whatever post-processing software you're using, so they can come into play. But generally when you're looking at your raw images, unless you have your post-processing software set up to grab this information, you're not seeing it. So really setting these is not all that important. I have my color or my picture style set to standard, my color space set to Adobe RGB. You know, it's standard stuff, but you can change it if you want. Depends on how you work with your images. HDR shooting, off. Auto lighting optimizer, off. Highline tone priority, off. I don't want the camera to prioritize highlights over shadows and things like that. Those of you who have watched my deep dive, my menu deep dive videos in the past, all the same settings, all the same reasons why I continue to keep them turned off. I just don't want the camera dealing with this kind of stuff. Nowadays, when you get into shooting RAW and you get into post-processing, you have a lot of latitude to work with recovering highlights and shadows and things like that. High dynamic range, high bit depth to a lot of these files now. I keep these things turned off. Go back up to the top to the fourth shoot menu. I shoot a white balance that is not auto white balance. You can go in here, you can pick all sorts of different white balance settings. I shoot a Kelvin value of around 6300 to 6500. The reason I do that is because sometimes I'll shoot a bunch of shots and I want to stitch them together, and I don't want the camera changing white balance in between the shots. And then that's just one more thing I have to deal with in post-processing to get them all to look the same. It's easily done these days, but it's just another step. I don't want to deal with it. I don't deal with setting a custom white balance, no white balance shifting, lens aberration correction. Go in there. Peripheral illumination correction is on. Distortion correction is off. Digital lens optimizer. Okay, so I'm going to turn actually this off and go in here and disable that. So now we've got most of all of this turned off. Chromatic aberration, turn that off. And diffraction correction, I'm going to leave that on. Here's why. Now, most of these I turn off, and I mess around with these things, and that's why they were turned on. And I don't really see a lot of value in doing this kind of correction in the camera. I much rather do it in post-processing, because that way I know where it's being done, and I don't want to be doing it twice, in camera and in the post-processing part of the workflow that I have. So by turning most everything off in camera, I don't have to think about what I had turned on in camera and what I may want to do then in post-processing, because it just gets more and more work to be done. Now, the diffraction correction I'm going to leave on, because my next video actually is going to be using the 200 to 800 on the R1 and the R5 Mark II with the 1.4 times teleconverter. Okay, and I'm going to be turning this on and off because I want to see what happens, because diffraction can come into play when you're shooting this lens combination with the teleconverter and these cameras, because you're really stopping down a lot. F13 when you're at 800 millimeters, or actually 1120 millimeters with the teleconverter. So I'm going to be playing around with this, so I'm going to leave this part of the correction on, then I'm going to be turning it off and that kind of thing. But I'm going to leave it on just to remind myself of what I'm going to be doing here later on for some more testing. So the point is, I don't really know if it's that effective or not, but we'll find out. Long exposure noise reduction is off in this camera. Don't shoot long exposures when I'm shooting birds. So that's off. High ISO speed noise reduction, you'll see that I have this set to the high position. I've actually messed around with this, turning it off, low, standard, high, because this camera is amazing at higher ISOs, and I wanted to see if these made any difference at all. It makes some, but my last setting was on high. I'm going to put it back to the default of standard. I didn't see a lot going on with high. Standard was working really well for me. I was happy with my noise and my images at ISOs as high as 40,000. Unbelievable with this camera. One of the huge advantages of the R1 over the R5 Mark II for sure. If you shoot in low light, you shoot higher ISOs to get your shutter speeds up in lower light conditions, or you're shooting a lens like the 2 to 8 or even the 1 to 5 that isn't all that fast, you need higher ISOs. The R1, unbelievable performance at higher ISOs. So, dust delete data, we're not going to go into that. Dust delete data, don't really deal with dust when we're shooting birds and birds in flight, because we shoot so wide open most of the time that even if there is quite a bit of dust on our sensors, we generally don't see it. Or if we do see it, it's a blob that's way out of focus. Now, if you're shooting a lot of landscapes, or you're shooting at really stop down apertures, f22 and stuff like that, any dust can be a real problem. So there is this option in here, but we're not going to deal with doing anything with it today. Multiple exposures, focus bracketing, they're grayed out. Again, things are grayed out because I've got pre-continuous shooting on. I'm shooting electronic shutter, whatever. That's why they're grayed out, but I keep these disabled anyway because I don't focus bracket generally. I don't do multiple exposures generally. So moving on down the line. Drive mode, let's go up to the top. Don't set that in the menu. Generally you have a button or something set up for that. I'll show you how I have my button set up to get to this, because the R1 can shoot 40 frames per second. 40, 30, 20, H+, H slow, whatever you want to call it, this frames per second drive mode setting. Wow. I don't always want 40 frames per second. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So I set up a button. We'll get to that later on to get to this very quickly, because sometimes I want to turn it down to 20 or even 10. Pre-continuous shooting, alluded to that a few times in bringing up some of these menus. An awesome thing in this camera. R5 Mark II as well. And I have it enabled because I have found a lot of uses for pre-continuous shooting. It's not just for getting takeoff shots of birds. It's for capturing when a kingfisher drops a minnow or a fish and stuff like that. All sorts of reasons to shoot pre-continuous shooting, and I have it enabled. Half press of the shutter button enables it, and a lot of people think that shooting this automatically means you're going to just be shooting so many more images. Not true, because if you half press, it is recording. But if you just go to no press then of the shutter button, you let off the half press, it doesn't record those images. It only records the images it was recording on half press if you go to full press and actually start shooting. So you have great control actually over how many images are being taken and captured off of the pre-continuous shooting mode. Love it. I really do like it. Internal timer disabled, bulb timer disabled. Not shooting bulb. Yeah, not shooting the Milky Way when I'm doing my birds, so we're not worried about any of that. Silent shutter function is turned off. Now, let's talk about silent shutter. Silent shutter is not what a lot of people think it is. It doesn't mean when you're in mechanical shutter, because, hey, it's actually only for electronic shutter. And that doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make everything silent. What it does is it turns off certain things when you enable this to make it quiet when you're shooting electronic shutter. So that's the whole deal there. Don't think silent shutter mode or function is going to make your mechanical shutter all of a sudden magically completely silent. It's not what it does. Shutter mode, it's grayed out. It's an electronic shutter. It's grayed out because I've got pre-continuous shooting enabled. This is a good example. If we go up here and disable this, now you can see that the shutter mode, electronic shutter, is now available to me. It's not grayed out anymore. One of those examples of interrelated things in these menus. I like shooting electronic shutter. For the most part, for birds in flight, electronic shutter is the way to go. Rolling shutter issues in this camera have been taken care of. You don't have to worry about that. And with electronic shutter, you can shoot 40 frames per second. And for birds like diving kingfishers and things like that, 40 frames per second can be really, really valuable. So overall, electronic shutter is great. It's quieter too. You can turn it completely off, the sound, or you can adjust the volume of your electronic shutter. I love shooting electronic shutter in this camera. Release shutter without card. That is turned off. I don't tether. I'm not shooting in a studio. I don't want this thing to be able to shoot when I don't have a card in there. It tells you there's no card in there anyway in the camera, so you don't have to really worry about it. But I don't want it to be releasing when there's no card in the camera. It's just not going to take any pictures when there's no card in the camera. Moving on down the line. Image stabilizer mode. Here you go. Current attached lens has image stabilization on the lens. And that's why it's grayed out. Also pre-continuous shooting. If, however, you put a non-IS lens on the R1, then this will become available to you, this menu item, and you can control the IBIS, the in-body image stabilization, turn it on and off, stuff like that. So that's what this is for. It's grayed out now because I have the 200 to 800 attached, and that lens has IS. Customized quick controls. Go in here and edit your layout however you like. Do whatever you want in here. I'm not going to go into this because that's a personal thing. Go in there and customize when you hit your Q button on the back of your camera, what comes up and how is it laid out. That's a personal thing. Go in there and do that if you like. Metering timer, 8 seconds. Again, this is one of those things where you can go in here and set it to whatever you want, depending on what you're doing. For me, 8 seconds is fine. Image review. Viewfinder display. This is the one. You need to disable this. Because if you're shooting bursts of images and then you stop shooting, it's going to bring up in your viewfinder, if you enable this, if you go in here and enable it, which we're not going to do, it will bring up the last image in the series, and if you want to shoot right away again, it's going to delay you being able to do that. That's not a good thing. Viewfinder display set to disabled. Review duration, set that to whatever you want. It's fine when you're looking at the LCD screen, or on the back if you hit the play button and you look at your images, but you don't want it to automatically display the last image in a burst in your viewfinder. High-speed display. It's grayed out because I am on H+ in my drive mode, and I have pre-continuous shooting turned on. Boy, pre-continuous shooting seems to limit a lot of things, and it does. High-speed display comes into play when you drop to H drive mode, slower frames per second. What it does is it helps alleviate lag in the viewfinder when you're shooting slower frames per second in mechanical shutter especially. And so on the R1, it really helps. It really helps. So try that if you're shooting, let's say, 10 frames per second in mechanical shutter. Now, blackout free display, I have that turned off. I just don't see this doing much. I've tried it all different ways, turning it on, turning it off, all different settings. I just don't see it do much. It's off. Anything that I don't see is of value to me, helping me, I turn it off. This is off. Display simulation. Exposure simulation is what I have it set to. You can go inside there. You can set it to exposure and depth of field. Exposure only during depth of field when you're hitting the button. Whatever. I set it to exposure simulation because, like I've said many times in my past videos, one of the huge advantages of shooting mirrorless cameras over older digital SLR cameras is that you can see your exposure through your viewfinder as you're changing things like shutter speed and aperture, and boy, is that nice. So that's what you get when you set it to exposure simulation. Optical viewfinder simulation view assist turned off. I don't want to see basically the ambient lighting conditions through the viewfinder. And that's what you get when you turn this on. So we leave it off. High dynamic range, C-Log view assist. Not going to go into this. I don't use it. Shooting information display. There's some things in here that are of value. Screen info settings. Pick what you want. You can manufacture the look when you're looking at the screen. Personal preference here. Do what you like. Viewfinder info toggle. This is the viewfinder now. The other one was the LCD screen. You can see I've done some things in here. I've unchecked number 2, so when I cycle through this by hitting the info button, I cycle between 1 and 3. 1 has basically nothing in there, And 3 has the histogram and the level in there. That's all I want. I do not like to see all this crap through my viewfinder. I want to see my bird, tracking my bird, and that's basically about it. Sometimes I want the level in there. If I'm shooting a bird walking, I just got done shooting a bunch of American oyster catchers foraging. Having the level in there was nice to keep a nice level shot when I'm slowly panning with these birds foraging and walking around in the water. Okay, viewfinder vertical display is off. You can turn this on if you want. It just changes how information is displayed in the viewfinder when you shoot in the vertical orientation. I'd show you how that looks, but doing it now with all this gear hooked up to my camera to record all this stuff for you for this video makes that almost impossible. So you can play around with this if you want. Turn it on, go to the vertical, and you'll see how things can be arranged and displayed if you turn this on. Grid display is off. Of course, that's pretty self-explanatory. You can do a 3x3 or a 6x4 or whatever. Grid display, again, I keep this stuff off. I do not want to see this stuff most of the time shooting birds and birds in flight. It just clutters up my view. Histogram display, brightness, you can do other things, RGB. I just keep it on brightness. I think most people do. You can change the size if you want. Again, if I do want it in there, I don't want it huge. It takes up too much of my view. I keep it small. Battery level percentage display. I like the percentage display over just the marks. Gives you more information. I like to get as much information as I can when I can. And so that's what turned on. Again, with the card free space display, I have percentage rather than just 999, you know. When you start out with these really big Compact Flash Express cards, I have a 1 terabyte card that I shoot with most of the time now, and 9999 doesn't tell me anything about how I'm using up the available space on my card. The percentage helps me, gives me more information. I like it. Lens info display. Focus distance display if you're going to shoot in manual focus mode. The focal length display, I like that enabled. I like to know when I'm shooting a zoom lens what focal length I'm at. It doesn't really matter. I compose my shot, but I can look then once if I'm going to be in a certain scenario for a while, I can look at, hey, I like this. Where am I? What focal length am I? 400 millimeters, 500 millimeters, 800 millimeters, what am I? So I can go back to that very quickly if I change it. If I'm in like shooting a really popular perch for a specific species or something like that. So I have that enabled. So vertical exposure level, that's your scale in your viewfinder. And if we go in there, I have it set to off right now. And if we go in there, you'll see that the exposure scale is on the bottom. If we go in here, go back in there and turn it on, now you'll see that it is on the right-hand side going vertically. What do you like better? I like it on the bottom. Not that I use it that much because I'm shooting full manual exposure, but it is somewhat of a reference to what I'm doing at times. I like it on the bottom. Go back in there. Is there anything else in there? Nope. I think we're good in there. Display frame rate setting. This should be in smooth, not power savings. Helps with the fresh rate being 120 hertz, not 120 frames per second. 120 hertz versus 60 makes things look smoother when you're shooting flying birds, fast subjects, things like that. Okay, down below you can see info. That's whenever you see something in a white box, that's a button on your camera that you can press. You press the info button and it puts a check mark in suppress lower frame rate. This is for the frame rate of the viewfinder. It goes along with the frame rate that you'd set with smoother power savings. And by suppressing it, keeping it from going to a lower frame rate, you're going to use more power and stuff, but in low light situations. If you have this checked, it may cause some issues and stuff. So it wants to go to a slower frame rate in low light. And if you suppress it, if you have it on power savings, if you suppress that, it may not focus as well and things like that. So this is something you just have to try if you're shooting in certain scenarios, like if you're in a nightclub or something, shooting a singer or whatever, or a band. Try turning this on and off, and you might see some effect on things like focusing and things. I keep it unchecked because I don't. If it needs to do certain things with the frame rate of the viewfinder, I want to let it go ahead and do that. But for birds and birds in flight, I don't think it's doing anything. Viewfinder magnification. There you go. I just keep it on Mag 1. I've never messed with that. Don't know why you'd want to mess with that. Maybe you have a reason. Let me know. Viewfinder display format. How do you want it to look? Like that or like that? It's a personal preference. Reverse the display. I don't want to reverse the display. I'm not shooting selfie stuff. I'm not out vlogging. Keep that off. Auto power off temp, standard. I mean, if you want it to get hot, really hot, before it shuts down, you can set it to high. I keep it on standard. With the R1, it's such a big body. It's not huge. Not as big as the old 1DXs and stuff like that. But anyway, it is a big enough space to where it doesn't really get very warm. Now the R5 Mark II gets very warm. I actually keep the cooling grip on there now when I'm shooting video a lot, along with a lot of stills and looking through the viewfinder a lot. Keeping the viewfinder on all the time heats things up as well. So here, I just keep it on standard. I've never had a reason to put it on high yet. Maybe I'll need to put it on high to keep it going a little longer in some scenarios. Not at this point. All right. I think we're done with the shoot menu. Moving on to the biggie. But before we go into the autofocus menu, I'm going to take a quick break because I get tired of talking. And I got to show a commercial. And then we'll be back doing autofocus. Okay, we're back, and here we go with autofocus menu. Autofocus operation. Servo for birds. Servo for just about everything. Shoot back button autofocus. You basically have servo and one shot all in one by setting it to servo. It's only going to focus when you have a button pressed, one of your back buttons. So you can go to one shot just by letting go of the button. Let's keep it in servo for birds and birds in flight. Autofocus area. This I have set up to have the different autofocus areas for different orientation of the camera. That setting comes further on down the line to set it up this way, but you can see that when I'm shooting in Landscape format, I have it set to spot in here. We'll talk about that later. When I go to vertical, one way or the other, I have it set to the flexible zone number 3. We'll go over that again in a minute. Well, maybe more than a minute. This is a long video. A lot of menu stuff. But we don't really set autofocus area by going into the main menu anyway. But having it set to a certain autofocus area in the main menu can be useful. Whole area tracking servo autofocus I have turned off, because generally I don't want it to switch to whole area tracking when I'm using things like spot autofocus or 1-point or something like that. The whole area tracking thing comes into play for me when I go to the, say, eye detection autofocus that's set up on one of my back buttons, which again we'll get to a little bit later on down the line. So I keep this turned off. Because if you have it on here, if you turn this on, then even if you're using a different autofocus area, once it finds a subject or what it thinks is a subject, it'll go to whole area tracking. Now, that's unless you're using one of the locked autofocus areas, which we'll talk about as well coming up. Focus mode, autofocus. Well, yeah, and it's grayed out. Why? Because of the lens that I have attached. It's an autofocus lens, and it does not have, now watch, here we go. Oh, go to manual focus. This, I just moved the switch, see, it says AF. Now it's going to say MF, manual focus. That's with the switch on the lens. If you have a lens attached to the camera that does not have a switch on it, then this may actually be lit up, and you can change between autofocus and manual focus here in the menu system. That's what that is for. Moving on down the line. How many times have I said that now? I hope you're not getting annoyed with that, but I'm going to try not to say that anymore. Subject to detect, none. Well, why is it set that way? Because I have it defined in different places. The thing about these cameras now, the R1 included, is that you can tell it the subject to detect in submenus when you're setting up custom buttons for back buttons, and that's the way I have things set up. So the subject to detect here isn't necessarily needing to be set to anything. Of course, if you're shooting birds, you'd think you'd go to animals, right? But I'm going to keep it to none. And we'll go over this later on when I'm setting up the custom back button autofocus, and we can see where we're setting up the subject to detect. Eye detection is disabled. Again, I don't want necessarily eye detection all the time. I'll set it up in the submenus now, or if I go directly to eye detection autofocus, that's built into the algorithm if you go to that, and so we don't need it turned on here. Register people priority. Well, you can go in there and register people, but I'm not shooting people. I'm shooting birds, animals, so I'm not going to register any people. Action priority, it's the next one down here. It's grayed out. A lot of these are grayed out because of other settings. Again, here you go. Subject to detect. Well, I have it set to none, so it's not going to look for people and stuff. And so it's grayed out. But if you did enable it, this is for certain sports. So let's just go up here. Let's go to subject to detect, and we'll go to people. And now that's enabled. And now you can go in here, and you can go to enabling the action priority. And you can go, you can shoot soccer, basketball, volleyball. That's all they have right now. But I'm sure they'll add some things. Hey, there may even be register animal priority coming. Wouldn't that? That's the next step, I think. So let's go back up here and set this back to none. I want to change if I can get there. Enough of this stuff. Let's keep moving. I had been shooting auto here for a while. But now I found on the R5 Mark II and the R1, I think it's doing better by going to the manual case. Down here it's M, it's blue, that's what I have selected. Before, there used to be a whole bunch of cases. If you've shot Canon for a long time, case 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all different containers, presets basically, for changing different tracking sensitivities in XL decel tracking. There used to be switching track subjects in here and stuff like that. That's completely gone now. Now you're down to two, auto and manual. I've switched back to manual with these settings down here. Tracking sensitivity being negative all the way, XL decel tracking being positive all the way. It's the stickiest autofocus settings you can make to stay on subjects. I like it. It works really well for me. If you want to change these parameters, you hit the rate button. Like I said earlier, anything that's in a white box with black lettering is a button. So if you hit rate right now, that'll allow you to go into each one of these parameters and change them. Like so. I'm not going to change them, but that's what allows you to do that. Hit the rate button to get back out of there. So this is how I have things set up. It works well for me. Once I get a good setting that I don't have to change a lot, I tend to keep it there. I like these settings. They're working well for me on the R1. Moving on down the line. Moving on to the next tab. Tab 4 in the autofocus menu. Servo first image priority. I'm going to set this to release all the time. All my cameras. I don't want it set to focus. When I press the shutter button to shoot, I want my camera to shoot. I don't want to wait for it to tell me, or when it thinks that the subject is in focus, to shoot. I set it to release. One shot autofocus release priority. I don't shoot in one shot. Ever. Got it set to focus. I mean, if I am going to shoot in one shot, I'm not shooting action. Maybe then focus is really important. Set it to focus. Don't ever do it though. But that's what I have it set at. Preview autofocus. Preview autofocus means continuous autofocus, and that means your camera and lens will be focusing all the time, whether you're pushing half press or a back button that you have set up for autofocus initiation or not. Keep this disabled. Lens drive when autofocus impossible. That's turned on. It's a remnant of, it cycles then if it misses. It's going to keep trying if you hold the button down. Mirrorless cameras don't cycle nearly as much as digital SLR cameras. 1DXs and my 5D Mark IV and stuff. It's not really as important as it used to be, but I keep it turned on. Autofocus assist beam firing, that's grayed out. Why? Oh, I bet you I know why. Pre-continuous shooting again. Anyway, this interrelated stuff. No assist beams necessary when shooting birds most of the time. So, and if you're pre-continuous shooting, it's off anyway. Next tab. Limit autofocus areas. I did. These are the, take a look. This is what I have available. I'm going to show one thing. I'm going to allude to one thing down here. There's the locked autofocus areas that I talked about. If you pick one of these, the settings that we were talking about just a minute ago in the main autofocus menu about whole area autofocus, switching to that, let's say, this overrides those settings. So if you're going to use the locked spot, in this case, you can have the whole area tracking autofocus turned on in the main autofocus menu, and if you're using this as your autofocus area, your locked spot autofocus, it won't switch to that. It won't switch to whole area autofocus, and it won't be looking for a specific subject either. It'll be switched to none. That's what these locked autofocus areas do for you. Orientation linked autofocus point. There we go. I have it set to area and points. You can do it the same for vertical and horizontal. That then, if we change that, let's just have it the same and go all the way back then to the beginning. Now you'll notice that the autofocus area, which used to have the 3 different orientations of the camera, now doesn't. It just shows the autofocus area that you have selected. That's what this does. if you go here and you do separate autofocus points, area and points, it will be back to this. And I like this because when I shoot vertical, I may want to have a more vertical oriented zone, and it switches to that automatically, and that's how I actually have it set up. Limit subject to detect: people, animals, and off. Don't shoot vehicles. Don't shoot races and stuff. Just don't like to cycle through a whole lot of things. If I'm cycling through things, I want only the ones I generally want or need. Left or right eye detection. I don't care which eye of the bird it focuses on. This is for people for the most part. You can turn some of these on and off. They're all on right now. I've just been lazy, I guess. I haven't turned them off. I could just leave it off in auto and we'd be fine. I'd be fine. Next, manual focus settings. If you shoot manual focus, sometimes you need to. Focus peaking. So, you want to see what focus peaking looks like? We can do that. Let's go into manual focus. And now you'll see there's the focusing guides, those little arrows coming together, and green, boom, that means it's in focus. The bird's in focus. Let's get out of here. Peaking on, high, let's go to color blue. It's hard to see the blue focus peaking, turning, going on around that bird. But it's there, and especially visible when you're looking through the viewfinder. And then if we go in and we turn the focus guides on, now you've got those little arrows. And when they come together and turn green, you know you've got your bird in focus, whatever that focus point is on. So they're helpful aids for sure if you're going to use manual focus. We're going to go back into autofocus mode. Go back into the menu. Get out of manual focus. Register and recall autofocus related settings. I have not set up any other than just a default thing when I was playing around. But once you get done with your autofocus relating settings, you can register them to a preset 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so you can quickly recall them for different shooting scenarios, which I think is great. So take advantage of that if you want to. It's even got a URL in there. You can go to a website. Autofocus setting guide available to you. All right, next, this is the playback menu. And there's not a lot to go over in here. Protect images. Unprotect all of them. Select a range, select images, do what you want to protect your images. You can do the same things with erasing images. I generally don't do any of this kind of stuff when I'm out shooting. It's too easy to make a mistake, especially with erase images. Just wait till you get home. Wait till you get to your hotel room if you're on a tour, whatever. This kind of stuff has no real bearing on the effectiveness of getting the images you're trying to get when you're in the field. Rating, copy image, go through these if you'd like. Next tab over, you can resize images in this camera. You can upscale. You can actually upscale images, but only raw images. I mean, but only JPEG or HEIF images, not raw images. So not a whole lot of advantage for me. Cropping, HEIF to JPEG conversion, do what you want in here. You can do a slideshow of images there on your card. Not going to spend time on this. Playback information display. What do you want in there? What do you want in there? Pick what you want. Highlight alert. That's your blinkies. Keep those enabled. Autofocus point display. Or you want to see the blinkies? Let's look at blinkies. Let's see if we can do that. There you go. There's the blinkies on the sky, not on the bird, but it shows you what they do. Whoopee, right? Yeah, it can be valuable. It can be valuable. Autofocus point display, I keep that disabled. That displays the autofocus point or area that was used to capture the image. I think it lags behind a lot, so I just keep that turned off. Playback grid, don't worry about it. Movie play count, no. Audio quality, play with that stuff if you like. Connections, the connections menu, network settings and all that kind of stuff. Airplane mode on, that keeps battery usage down, I think. And so, you know, who doesn't want to keep the usage of their battery to a minimum? Turns off a bunch of stuff that you don't need, that I don't need. So I keep that on. I'm not going to spend any more time on connecting things. All sorts of stuff you can do in here. You want to connect a smartphone, tablet? Go ahead. Moving on. The setup menu, the yellow wrench menu, record function. How do you want to use your cards? Do you want to separate, put them on different cards for stills and videos? Do you want, when you're recording to stills to cards and you have two cards in your camera and one fills up, what do you want it to do? I want it to auto switch cards. I don't want to stop shooting if my primary card fills up. Some people will set this to record to multiple. That means you're going to record each image to two different cards, that kind of thing. If you're shooting weddings, I get it. For birds and birds in flight, I've never had a card fail in the field. Never had a card fail. I do auto switch card for both stills and video recording. Right now it's on card 2 because it's the only card I have in the camera. You can change folders. You can create a folder. As you go along, as you're shooting, you can put things into different folders. Can be useful. Continuous numbering, clip numbers, all that kind of stuff. Pretty much all default settings here. Beep. Let's go all the way down to beep in this menu. And you want that enabled, because with that enabled, then you can change the volume of a lot of different things, including your shutter with your electronic shutter. I have it turned down 1 notch. The gray arrows were the defaults. For focusing, I have the beep turned completely off. I don't want it to go beep every time the camera gets focused on something, and I don't think the person shooting next to me wants to hear that constantly either. Your audio monitor. Choose what you like. Screen brightness, I have turned all the way up. The only time I use my LCD screen anymore is when I'm showing somebody a menu setting or a picture, and generally it's outside in bright light. It just helps the person be able to see what I'm trying to show them. Viewfinder brightness, on the other hand, needs to be accurate to what the exposure simulation is showing you in order for you to set your exposures well, looking through the viewfinder when you're using exposure simulation settings like we talked about before. So I have that set to auto. It does a relatively good job. Screen viewfinder color tone, don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care. That was easy. Shutter at shutdown. Yeah, put the shutter down. It still has a mechanical shutter in there. Put it down, protects the sensor, protects it from dust. Sure. Power savings, sensor cleaning. You want to clean the sensor manually or have it do it? Fine, do it. Power savings. Screen dimmer 5 seconds, screen off, disable, auto power off 5 minutes, viewfinder off 1 minute. Pick what you'd like. I just don't want my camera turning on and off a bunch. Usually when I'm shooting, it's pretty active shooting, and so I don't want it powering off all the time and me having to power back on. Pick what you like here. I don't want to reset the camera. Here's your custom shooting modes. You can register your settings. You go in there, and then it's going to say, well, where do you want to register them? To C1, C2, or C3. You can clear settings, and then you have an auto update setting. Enable it or disable it. For me, custom shooting modes are for saving menu settings for very different genres of photography. Bird photography, landscape photography, astrophotography, C1, C2, C3. It's not for birds, static, C1, birds in flight, C2. It's for if you need to change between the different shooting scenarios or genres, a bunch of menu settings, not just your shutter speed or something like that. There's other ways to deal with that. So C1, C2, C3, C1 birds, C2 landscape, C3 astrophotography. Auto update settings. This is important, whether you have this on or off, enabled or disabled. The thing about this is that if you have it disabled, then you can change all the settings you want, of course, as you're shooting. You're in C1 for birds, and you can change any setting you want, and it's not going to change any of the settings registered to C1. If you enable it and you make a bunch of changes, then it's going to resave those, and it's going to change basically your C1 custom mode. I actually keep it enabled because the only thing I generally change if I'm shooting in C1 would be, let's say, shutter speed and aperture and ISO as things are changing and I'm doing different kinds of shots. And I don't, if the camera times out and I don't have this enabled, it's going to go back to, let's say, a shutter speed that was registered a long time ago that may be 1/250th of a second, and I may at this point be at 1/2500th of a second. I leave it enabled so that as I'm changing my exposure settings, those are changed. So if my camera does time out and I bring it back on, it's at the settings that I'm currently using. That's why I keep this enabled. You can, of course, save and load camera settings on the card. That's nice. Especially if you have to send it off to Canon, they reset everything to default on your camera. You get it back, and you have to change everything back again. Just load them back on from the card that you saved them to before you sent it off. Battery information. You can register batteries, and it'll tell you performance and shutter counts and all this kind of stuff. It's kind of neat. Firmware, this is where you would do the firmware updates, things like that. All right, I'm going to take another break here, and we'll be back shortly to move on to another really important menu, and that is the customized controls for shooting or when shooting menu. Okay, onward to the custom controls. Customized buttons for shooting, really important. And here's how I have them set up for stills. We're not going to go into video, not in this video. Shutter half press, metering start only, because all of my autofocus stuff is on back buttons. Video shooting button is for movie recording start and stop. Don't use that button. Again, that's a different video. Multifunction button. Well, I have it set up basically default And you can get at all sorts of stuff in here. Timed out on me. Just by using the different dials. I think it's useful. I won't tell you what I wish I could do with that button, the multifunction button, which is the little button up by the shutter button. The R1 has multifunction buttons number 2 and 3. You can see where that is on the front of the camera, on the top. I have small hands. I have a hard time reaching those buttons. So what I have those set to really is, I haven't set them for anything. I messed around with them and they're set to start and stop full area or whole area autofocus tracking for number 2 and for aspect ratio and cropping for number 3, but because I can't really reach those buttons very well, I don't really use them. But that's what I have them set up for now. I've got the little illumination button, little light bulb, set up for what the default was, to turn on the light of the little LCD screen up there for the most part. The mode button is the mode button. Okay, so now on to the good stuff, the autofocus on button, and how amazing and unique this button is on the Canon R1. It is a 2-stage button, half press and full press. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to show you how I've got mine set up. But before I do that, we need to go over some things about how Canon has implemented this. They use presets. Presets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, it'd be awesome if you could go in each one of these presets and put anything you want, assign any function you want to the metering, to the half press, and the full press of the button, but you can't. Canon does limit you to a certain extent on what you can assign to the half press and full press of the button, but they give you 7 presets, allowing you to do some different things, and in the end, you're going to find, I think, that you can pretty much get it set up in a really good way. Let's look at some of this stuff first, kind of how Canon has done this, how they've implemented it. Autofocus on preset 1. Look in that gray rectangle. Half press, I have set at this point, it's set to, I don't know if I've set it or what, been doing so much messing around with this camera. To half press, it's metering and autofocus start. To full press, it says no function, disabled. And the key is here, look at that, and on the actual little icon there for the button press, there's a lock symbol there. This kind of harkens back to the autofocus areas where some of them are locked. They have lock symbols. That means you can't change it. So if we go and hit info button here, and we go into autofocus on preset 1, you can see that for half press, I can go in there and I can assign some sort of function to the half press. It doesn't have to be autofocus related even. I'm using it for autofocus stuff, but anyway, you can assign it to pretty much any of those icons you saw there. But if you go down and highlight the full press, autofocus on, it says no function disabled, and I can hit the set button here and I can't go in there. Back out. Again, that's because the no function disabled has the lock symbol. That means you can't change it. Let's go over to autofocus on preset 2. Now the lock symbol is on the half press. So if we go in here, hit the info button, and we try to change and assign something to the half press, I can hit the set button and I can't get in there. Again, it's locked. There's no function available there on this preset. If I go down to the full press, I can go in and assign something to it. I have, at this point, assigned register and recall a shooting function, and within there, I've basically defined a autofocus action setup for what I want. In this case, it's a zone with no whole area autofocus. But anyway, I use autofocus on 2, preset sometimes, because if I just want the autofocus on button to function basically like the autofocus on button does on the R5 Mark II, just a single function button, I would pick autofocus on preset number 2 and set it up to do what I want. In this case, it's the register and recall shooting function. If we go over to number 3, which is what I have selected right now, you can see that the metering and autofocus start is locked. So you can make some changes to that, but it's going to only be, you can only assign on the half press of this metering and autofocus start, but the bottom one, the full press of the autofocus on button, you can again set to whatever you want within those icons that are available to you. So let's hit the info button on the autofocus on preset 3, which is the one I use the most, I've been using the most. I have the metering and autofocus start on the half press, that's the locked part, but I can go in there and change some things, and I set it up the way I want it. So let's hit the info button now, and you can go into the metering and autofocus start, and you can see what I have set up in here, and it's pretty simple. I have autofocus operation set to servo, got that check marked, so it's gonna function. I have the autofocus area check marked, so it will function, and I have that set to the locked spot autofocus. That means no whole area tracking and no subject to detect. It's set to none automatically because it's locked, but that's what I want. I want what I call a pure spot autofocus, and that's what we have here by doing this setup. Moving down, I have nothing else checked. Pretty simple in there. Let's go back then and look at how I have the full press of this setup. We'll highlight the register and recall a shooting function, hit the info button again, and go in and let's see what we've got set up in here. Autofocus area is check marked. This time though with my zone, flexible zone 1. If we go down from there, the next thing, check marked, subject to detect. I want it to be animals. Next, eye detection is checked. I have it set to auto because I want eye detection here. And then I have some other things set in here which I really don't need to have activated with the check marks, like tracking sensitivity, XL decel tracking, because those are set up already in my case, my manual case, like we went over earlier. But I have them turned on in here too. Doesn't hurt to have them turned on in 2 places. But if I didn't have them turned on here, it would default back to the other settings. And that's fine too. Main thing here, check mark, autofocus operation, and that's on because I want the autofocus to, of course, autofocus when I press the full press of the button. So that is how I have my autofocus on 3 preset setup. And I principally have been using either autofocus on 2 or autofocus on 3 presets. Number 2, if I want the old functionality of basically just one function button, full press, no half press to worry about. Or if I want 2 functions, the spot and then the zone, because I like to have the spot on half press to snipe, I guess, or to show the autofocus my subject if it's a bird in a bunch of branches or surrounded by a bunch of stuff that may compete with the autofocus's attention. Identify the subject with spot by half pressing, and then once I've got it in focus, go to full press, go to zone, so I can track that bird a little bit within the zone and get the eye detection going. So that's how I have those set up. Now there's also autofocus preset 4, 5, 6, and 7, and they offer some different combinations of things that you can do. Again, autofocus on preset 4 is locked, and the metering and autofocus start at half press, but you can again change the full press. I have it on eye detection autofocus. Just something a little bit different. Moving on over to autofocus on 5 preset. Metering and autofocus start on the top again is locked, but full press you can put whatever you want on there. So let's go in there. Let's go into number 5, hit the info button. Can't do anything. We could change around whatever we want there on the half press. But if we go down here, we can, again, do whatever we want down here, assign whatever we want. Go back out. Number 6, metering and autofocus start locked again on the top. No function down below on the full press, but there's no lock symbol there. So that means if we hit the info button and we go down to the full press, it says no function disabled, but we can assign things because there's no lock symbol. That means it's open to assigning whatever function we want throughout this exhaustive menu of things. Go back out to number 7. You can have the metering and autofocus start again on the top and whatever you want on the bottom. So again, there you go. You can go through here and pick the ones you want. I basically have been using autofocus on preset 2 and autofocus on preset 3, and we can go in and we can see how these actually function. So let's go ahead and set and choose autofocus on preset 3, and we'll see how it actually functions, which is what I have set now. So we'll go into shooting mode, and if I half press the autofocus on button, it should just give me spot. Why, I said earlier on, why did I have in my main autofocus menu, my autofocus area for landscape orientation of the camera set to spot? Because that's what I want to display on through my viewfinder when I'm looking all the time. Because it's like a gun sight for me, and so you see it here, but when I press half press, it should activate spot and only spot. And there it is. And it goes right to the bird, and it's blue, and that means it's focused. We can come over here, half press, goes to the background, back over here, half press, uses spot to get on the bird. Now if I go to full press, it goes to the zone. And I have eye detection turned on, remember, in that zone, in that info detail set menu, and now it will track within the zone. If I go outside the zone, it stops tracking in there. It doesn't track the bird anymore. This is what I want. I don't want full area, whole area tracking. I like this setup. Now, if we go in and I change that button to autofocus on 2, remember, I have only, if I half press now, nothing happens because that is disabled. Only full press works here, and it goes to that zone because I use zone a lot. This smaller zone with eye detection and tracking within the zone only, I use that a lot. And so if I'm going to use just one position of that dual position autofocus on button, it's going to be full press. If I'm going to do that, I want the zone. I could set up a button to do the same thing, a preset to do the same thing, where when I did full press, it would just go right to spot. Pretty flexible when you think about it and you look at how you can set it up. I really like this dual function button, and we'll get into what this allows. It allows you to have 3 back button autofocus without using all 3 of the back buttons. We'll talk about that. So if we move down to the autofocus on, now we're in the smart controller, and I have that turned off. I don't want to be moving my autofocus points around and stuff with it. The only thing I use it for is, we can go in there. Okay, so now you're going to move your autofocus points. Now you're going to direct your autofocus points during metering only and stuff like that. I have it turned off because I just use it really when I'm reviewing my pictures, to scroll around and look at my pictures when I zoom in on them, either on the back of the camera on the LCD screen or in the viewfinder. So I keep that turned off. The asterisk button. 3 back buttons were always the most awesome thing that the newest Canon cameras offered. You had autofocus on, asterisk, and then the autofocus point button on the far right. You can set them all up to do different autofocus stuff, and that was awesome. Now, but you know what? I never liked the far right one because it was a cramp, you had to really reach over with your thumb and shoot, and it was kind of a cramped situation for my thumb. So now we can do 3 autofocus area initiation setups just using 2 buttons, because the autofocus on button has 2 stages, and now we have the second button, which is the asterisk button, which is still in a nice position for my thumb while I'm shooting, and I have that set up to eye detection autofocus. There you go. So if we get out of there and go in here and I press my asterisk button, it's going to go directly to full frame, whole area tracking, whatever you want to call it, but eye detection. And there it goes. So it goes right to the bird's eye and tracks it through the entire frame. You can see the brackets move to the entire frame. That's how I use 3 back buttons now, but just using 2 back buttons that are much more comfortably located on the back of the body. Don't have to use the autofocus point button, this button, for autofocus anymore. And what do I use it for? I have it set up for drive mode. So if I'm shooting and I hit the far right autofocus point button, it goes to drive mode, and I can quickly change to different frame rates. Because like I said earlier, sometimes I don't want 40 frames per second. I'm shooting diving ospreys or diving kingfishers. 40 frames per second, absolutely. If all of a sudden I have some flying in oyster catchers, for example, I may be shooting H+, but then it lands and it's just moving around doing some things. Slowly, I can go to H or even low speed continuous and shoot much less frames per second, coming home with fewer pictures. Sometimes that's a good thing. So anyway, I'm going to put it back on H+ real quick. That's how I have my 3 back buttons set up at this point, and I like this setup. Depth of field preview button is still depth of field. The set button is for eye control autofocus. That is not the same as eye detection and tracking. This is where you have the little target in there and you control it with your eyeball. Wherever you're looking, that's where the target goes. I don't use it. I just haven't found a scenario where it works for me that's any faster. How is that any faster than just putting that spot on your target? If I have multiple birds out there and I want to get, let's say, this bird over here, yes, I know there's not a bird there. I just move it over and get it. Boom, boom, wherever I want it. And then just hit the button. Got it, got it, got it, got it. I don't see the whole look and then shoot thing being any quicker. Not for me in any of the scenarios I shoot in. So I don't really use that. That's kind of a default thing, and I just kept it there. Of course, the multi-controller, your little thumb joystick, I have that set to move my autofocus points around, which is really nice. Boom, 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 doo, doo. Press it in, straight in, and it goes back to center. That works for me. What else we got down here? Your lens function button. Some lenses have buttons on them. I have it set to change the subject to detect. Why? I don't know. It's what I have it for. I don't do anything else yet. Believe me, the way I have everything set up on my camera, I'm pretty quick and it works really well for me. So I'm not doing a whole lot of other stuff. So that is customized buttons for shooting. Well, what about dials? Well, there's not a whole lot of stuff going on here. Heck, I haven't even changed my control ring yet to change my autofocus areas. I should do that. Why don't we do that? Select autofocus area. While holding the metering button? No. I just want to select my autofocus area. So there you go. So that's what I'm going to have my control ring set up for, and that's what I have it set up for on all my other camera bodies as well. As far as the main dial, the one up by your shutter button, that's set to control my shutter speed. Then the mode dial, they call it the quick dial, quick control dial too. I call it the mode dial. That's set up for my ISO. And then, you got to be able to change your aperture. So when you're shooting manual, full manual, you want to be able to change all 3 parameters for your exposure. So there you go. That's on the, what I call the thumb wheel. They call it the quick control dial 1, but I call it the thumb wheel. So there you go. What else do we want to talk about in here? Nothing's really important here because it's just personal preference and how you plus or minus which direction and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to deal a whole lot with that. Switching between, shooting video and stills, they got a dedicated switch for that. Keep it that way. Not a whole lot. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this stuff. Autofocus area select control. Well, that's my multifunction button. I showed you that just a minute ago. All this stuff, personal preference stuff, customized buttons for playback. Hey, have fun with that if you want to. You can jump images all over the place. Let's go in here and put that on 1 because that's really what we want. Just 1. Again, I've been changing things, messing around with everything, but this is where I generally have that. So when I move my main dial, I get 1 image at a time, but most of the time you're using your thumb wheel for that. And you go like that, and jump to first image of the scene, or hey, how about just 1 by 1? That's where I want it. Okay, moving over 1. Eye control, don't care about this kind of stuff. Touch control, standard. Actually, you know what? I'm going to disable touch control. Nah, standard. You want it to move real easy, quick, or do you want it to be the standard sensitivity? Standard sensitivity. Okay, one more break, and we're going to move on to the last main menu that we have to deal with here, and that's our shooting mode, exposure stuff, and what used to be the customize menu. So stay tuned. All right, into the last main menu that we need to cover in this video. Restrict shooting modes, if you want to. Go in there. I turned off C2 and C3 for right now. Why did I do that? I don't know. Just was messing around, I guess. I don't really need TV. Don't really need AV. I don't really need P, and I don't really need FV. Yeah, always messing with stuff. Go in here now. I can show you how you turn things on and off. Not that you can figure that out, but anyway, we just did that. Full manual, like I said. Bulb. Yep, I do use bulb sometimes. External intervalometer or something like that. C1. Hey, let's turn on C2 and C3 too. There we go. Oh, look at that. It says shooting mode restriction is not applied in C1 through 3. That's interesting. Well, anyway, we can go ahead and get out of there. Exposure level increments, 1/3, 1/3. Speed metering, ISO auto. I don't shoot auto ISO very often, but when I do, and then I go out of auto ISO and I switch my ISO to, let's say, 500 or 800 or 1000 or whatever, when metering starts and stops, then it'll revert. Once metering is done, it'll revert back to the auto ISO setting, but maybe I don't want that. Well, that's what this is for. You can change this. So restore auto ISO after metering, then pick that one. If you don't want it to, if you want it to stay on the ISO 1000 or whatever you changed it to, moving out of auto ISO when the metering thing starts and stops all the time, well then set it here and then it'll stay on your ISO 1000 or whatever. And that's the way I like it. That's the way I have it set. Again, I don't shoot auto ISO hardly ever. Bracketing auto cancel, keep that on if you ever shoot bracketed shots. And then of course you're going to forget that you have bracketing turned on. Here it'll auto cancel that once the camera times out, comes back on. That's fine. That's the way I like it. Bracketing sequence, change that however you like. Number of bracketed shots, change that to whatever you like if you're shooting bracketing. Safety shift off. Same ISO for new aperture when you're shooting a variable aperture lens like the 200 to 800 like I have on here right now. if you change your aperture, if you zoom in and out and your aperture is changing because it has to, but you don't want your exposure to change, so you can set this to ISO, and it'll change your ISO to keep your exposure the same as you zoom in and out, and your f-stop setting changes. Great feature. AE lock meter mode after focus. Don't really care. Don't really care about restricting my metering modes because I shoot full manual. I don't care about what metering modes are available for the most part. Metering used in manual exposure. Specified metering mode, whatever I have set. Set shutter speed range. Nope, didn't change anything there. Didn't set aperture range either. I want them all available to me. Moving on over. AE micro adjustment, FE micro adjustment. Nope, off. Continuous shooting speeds. Oh, we can go in here and have all sorts of fun. For electronic shutter, you can set your high speed. What do you want it to be? You can set your super high speed. That's your high speed continuous super plus mode up there, and then you can go high speed. You can change that if you want. Right? You can go down to low speed, change that if you want. But you can't change it to just whatever you want. Depending on what you have high speed continuous plus set to and high speed set to and low speed set to, it will influence what you can change the other ones to. I'll let you mess around with that. I'm not going through all the combinations that you can possibly come up with here. I like 40, 30, 10. Works for me, seems reasonable. All right. Limit continuous shot count. Nope. If I want to shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot at 40 frames per second because I'm in C-RAW, like I said earlier, and I have pretty much an unlimited buffer, shooting 40 frames per second to a fast compact flash express card, which we now have 2 slots for in this camera, then I want it to shoot 1,000 shots if that's what I want. No limiting the continuous shot count. Maybe you want to do that. I don't want to restrict my drive modes either. You want to restrict those? I don't want to restrict those. I'm good. Having them all available to me. Add cropping information? Nope. Shutter release time lag. Shutter release time lag. Let's hit the information button there and see what it says. For even faster shutter release, specify to deactivate control of the release time lag, which is usually controlled for stability of the shutter release timing. You know what? I haven't found this to do anything. I just leave it on standard. Default erase option, that's if you need to press a confirm when you want to erase something. I don't erase things from my camera very often because that gets me into trouble. I'll erase things that I don't want to erase when I'm out in the field. Nope. Not messing with any of that. AV setting without lens off, release shutter without lens off, retract lens. Yeah, sure. I don't really have a power lens. It retracts on its own. I don't care about IPTC information either. Oh my goodness. And then we're at the last here, clear all custom functions. Well, I definitely don't want to do that. And then the last menu is your My menu. And I have one My menu set up, and the only thing in it is format card, because I want to be able to get to that really quickly. Maybe I actually have 2 of them set up. Nope, I don't. That is it. We went through the whole shebang with the R1 and covered a lot of stuff. You know what? Let's get out of the menu, back into my studio, and we'll finish this up. Okay. So my R1 is still over there attached to my external recorder and stuff, so I don't have it with me now, but that's the full run through of the menu system of the R1 and how I have it set up for when I go out and shoot birds in flight and wildlife in general. So I hope you found it somewhat useful, and if you did and you like my channel overall, please subscribe, because it keeps me motivated, if nothing else, to continue to do these videos. And I think YouTube likes it too. I really don't pretend to know how they deal with all that kind of stuff and their algorithms and all that, but I like to see people subscribing, and I like to see people watching. So until next time, be safe out there. I hope you're having good light. Hope you're getting great images. I'll see you soon.